So my name is Gary Kinsman. In terms of identification, I could say lots of things, but I would probably say activist scholar. With more of the emphasis on activist, I would certainly not usually like to be described as an academic. And so I would put the emphasis on being a queer, social justice, anti-capitalist activist and someone who's done scholarly and intellectual work around those questions.
Okay. And so our first mandatory question is, tell us a bit about your work, and given how you just described yourself, that could be your activism work, it could be your scholarly work, and how it addresses queer liberation.
Right. Well, I came out in the early 1970s when I was involved in the revolutionary and radical left and got involved in the gay liberation movement. I was on the executive of the Gay Alliance Towards Equality. So, I actually had some roots in what I would describe as queer activism coming out of the mid-1970s. But I think the sort of point at which my activist work and my intellectual work came together was really when I started to do graduate studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in the early 1980s. And I was studying with Marxist feminist sociologist Dorothy Smith, but also George Smith happened to be a research assistant in the sociology department at OISE at that time. And so I started to do my intellectual studies for my MA program, but immediately got thrown into the Right to Privacy Committee and the massive resistance to the bath raids. So one of the sort of decisions I made was that I wanted my activist work and my academic or intellectual work to be linked together. So I was heavily involved in the Right to Privacy Committee in '81 and also in Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere, but was also very involved in trying to do intellectual, scholarly work around it. Also got very interested in queer history and lesbian and gay history and the initial formation of a lesbian and gay history project in Toronto. So I've always sort of felt that what I'm trying to do, given I've found myself in the academic world, is to try to use the spaces and the capacities and the resources that are there to try to do historical and sociological work for queer liberation. And I think that for me is really important. I'm not interested in studying the movements that I'm involved in. I'm actually interested in trying to produce knowledge for activism, for changing the world. And I think that's sort of how I see the relationship between my activism and my scholarly and intellectual work.
Can you share with us experiences you've had that you think are significant for how we think about queer liberation as theory or practice?
Well, I guess I talk about it both in terms of activist and intellectual context. So, I was involved in the resistance to the bath raids in terms of the Right to Privacy Committee. I was involved in organizing against Canadian customs censorship. I've been involved in AIDS Action Now. I've been involved in activism both in big places like Toronto, but also in smaller places like St. John's, Newfoundland, the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, and also in Sudbury. So, I've got a range of different activist types of experiences that have been really important to me. But really what I learned the most from was the resistance to the bath raids and from AIDS Action Now. The resistance to the bath raids in terms of how queer people could mobilize massively out of the bars and come into the streets and produce a dramatic social movement that could actually turn back the police offensive against us in '81. And that was also really inspiring in terms of mass organization, like the meetings at Jarvis Collegian of 1,500 people where we would actually collectively decide what we were going to do, the meetings of the Public Action Committee of the Right to Privacy Committee that could have 400 people at them, that involved lots of different people, but the driving dynamism was actually sort of street people, bar people, working class queer people, mostly men, but also involving a significant number of lesbians. And the demonstrations that were held in 1981 against the bath raids were really quite inspiring. I learned an awful lot from that. I think we really turned the city on its ear and pushed back a police offensive, also creating the conditions for the lesbian and gay communities to really expand in a much more profound way in Toronto. AIDS Action Now was similarly really formative for me because I think it was really important in terms of how we were able to take people's anger and rage and to politicize that and to make that into the basis for a social movement, but also that we used direct action types of politics, occupation, sit-ins, die-ins, that we actually used very dramatic forms of action to put as much pressure as we could on the government and on the pharmaceutical corporation. So those for me are probably the most pivotal moments. There's other important things like the founding of the Toronto Lesbian and Gay Pride Day Committee. There's a whole bunch of other experiences that were really formative for me, but I think I learned the most from, in terms of activism, from the resistance to the bath raids and from AIDS Action Now, organizing in Toronto. Theoretically, or more academically, if you want to call it that, I think one of the discoveries I made was, especially in the context of doing work at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, was twofold in character. First of all, was to recognize that part of what we were up against is what I describe as heterosexual hegemony, so that the problems that we experience in our lives and in our oppression are not simply the result of homophobia. It's not simply a result of bad ideas in some straight people's heads. I mean, homophobia was historically really important for our movements in the early 1970s because, you know, we've been constructed as being mentally ill, and we were able to turn that back on heterosexuals who didn't like us by saying, no, it's not our problem, it's your problem. And that was, I think, a real sort of dramatic and important inversion. But the problem with homophobia is that it carries with it sort of the individualist psychological notions of psychology and psychiatry. And we sort of imported that into our theorizing. And it's been unfortunate, I think, that the major way in which people have come to understand queer oppression, not only including in queer communities, but outside it as well, is through this notion of homophobia, which really does have this idea that it's sort of bad ideas in people's heads, and we don't really see the social relations and institutional context where those ideologies and practices really come from. So trying to talk about institutionalized heterosexuality, trying to talk about heterosexual hegemony, which is the notion I developed in The Regulation of Desire, using Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony, I think was really important, because what I was trying to get at was we weren't simply oppressed in the sense of being repressed in a coercive way, right? We weren't sort of forced to be heterosexual in this society by someone holding a gun to our head, right? Although there are clear moments of repression, violence, coercion, right? In terms of queer bashing, in terms of all sorts of things around the marginalization and exclusion that we face. But the other side of the oppression that we face, beyond sort of direct repression, is the active production of consent to heterosexuality being the only normal, natural sexuality in our society. So we have to deal with both of those polarities, both the repressive aspect of what we're up against, but also that sort of common sense, everyday heterosexism that is constructed in our society. So the active incitement and construction of heterosexual desire, heterosexist desire in our society. So that's, I would say that's one of the more significant theoretical contributions I've made. The other thing is to always focus, and I learned this both from the Right to Privacy Committee and from AIDS Action Now, is if you really need to know the social organization of the forces you're up against. So the bath raids weren't organized by police officers with individual homophobic ideas, right? They're actually organized through the Criminal Code of Canada, which criminalized consensual queer sex. If you understand what you're up against, you can be much more effective in your organizing and your resistance around AIDS Action Now. Similarly, it wasn't that the government was just AIDS phobic or homophobic. There were more significant problems in the social organization of healthcare delivery and the development of treatments and drugs for people than that we actually had to attend to. So I've also felt that activism has to be informed by an analysis of the social organization that we're actually up against. And that's also led me to try to suggest that one of the things we actually need to do is to map out the social relations of struggle that our movements are involved in, so we can identify weak points for moving forward, but also identify who our possible allies are at particular points in time.
Okay. And how would you define your role in the queer movement?
Well, I mean, again, largely as activist and sometimes as organizer, but I do think I've also been a historian and a sociologist of our movements, and in some ways a theorist of our movements, trying to give people some of the critical tools and capacities, the social literacies, the social languages through which we can adequately understand our social locations and experiences, so that we can adequately understand the situations we find ourselves in and begin to move forward. Part of that's also been, I mean, a relatively isolated place to be in some ways, is that's led me to be quite critical of some of the sort of mainstreaming currents within the broad gay and lesbian movements, sort of currents that are more accommodated to forms of neoliberalism, the commercialization and commodification of Pride Day, the attacks on queers against Israeli apartheid. And these have all been issues that I've been really intensely interested in, but also involved around. And it seems to me that part of what I've actually been is a sort of critic over the years of that mainstreaming process, the ways in which only some sections of the white gay men's and to some extent white lesbian communities have been integrated into forms of capitalist normality. So I've been a sort of outspoken critic of that. That's had certain consequences, right? I mean, just to mention one is, I did some of the early historical sociological research on queer oppression within the Canadian state formation, and I was an expert witness in lots of cases, but once it came to the same-sex marriage cases, because I actually wouldn't sort of toe the line that, same-sex marriage is the only way sort of forward for us, and because I would raise critiques of that, because basically my position is same-sex marriage on the level of formal equality, obviously, we need to fight for it. On the other hand, it's a social practice of discrimination to try to institutionalize marriage in a more privileged social situation than any other types of relationships that exist in our society. So that sort of double-sided critique meant that when it came to someone who could testify as an expert witness, in some of those legal cases, I was dropped like a hot potato. I mean, early on, there was a little bit of that too, because my approach to sexuality is that sexuality is socially made, right? So I don't buy the line, which I think some people only accept tactically, that queerness is simply biological in character, right? So it's natural, so it doesn't raise any troubling social questions. But for me, all sexualities are socially made, including heterosexuality, and that opens up much more profound questions of being able to challenge sexual normality in our society. And I think that the sort of biological determinist or essentialist position that our queerness is simply rooted in our genes or hormonal developments or whatever it is, that really leaves us in a very limited place, because really it's an argument for a small-scale minority group to be sort of ghettoized in society, and it prevents us from actually having more radical challenges to the social world much more generally.
Great. Yeah, there's so much we can get into, but I'm going to keep us going here. We come to the next mandatory part of questions, one being, how would you define queer liberation?
Well, it's interesting in that sense, because I actually remember in the 1987, the first edition of the Regulation of Desire, that I actually subtitled part of the book, A Queer View of Canadian History, right? So I was actually using the word queer, it's sort of being taken up in a new way by sort of queer nationalist activism in terms of queer nation, but also in a certain sense prior to the real emergence of queer theory in the United States in terms of the humanities and cultural studies. So what did I mean by that? I simply meant, in a certain sense, that our look at history, like history from our vantage point, would look really different. And in a certain sense, that was about queering Canadian history, or what we call Canada right now, or the northern part of Turtle Island, whatever expression we want to use. So I did capture a little bit that would develop later on in terms of notions of what queer liberation was about. I guess for me, the three crucial components of queer liberation politics is, first of all, an attempt to reclaim language, to reclaim the term queer, which historically was actually used by queer people in a much more affirmative, positive way than by queer bashers attacking us, but to reclaim that term of abuse, to neutralize it so it can no longer be used against us. But more importantly than that, also to develop a way of describing our experiences that is much broader than sort of clinical terms around homosexual or lesbian or gay, that can actually try to encompass all of the experiences of people who are in rupture in whatever way with institutionalized heterosexuality and also the two-gender binary system. That it's a term that hopefully can encompass those various experiences, rather than, and in that sense, rather than seeing ourselves as sort of this small, narrow minority group, we actually see ourselves, like the early gay liberation movement did in some ways, as like there's actually a queer or gay potential in everyone. And we're actually about a liberationist politics for all of those erotic social possibilities that move beyond institutionalized heterosexuality and that move beyond the two-gender binary system that we currently largely live with, although we're in rupture with it at the same time. So those are two important elements. And the third element is actually having a place from which we can queer normality, right? So part of my work has been queering national security, but clearly from the vantage point of queer people, being able to queer various aspects of the social world that are just accepted as, taken for granted, that's just the way it is, that's just normal. So part of it is like a constant, consistent questioning and challenging of normality from the vantage point, from our social standpoints as queer people. I mean, I would like to say that queer liberation politics is always defined by a type of commitment to taking up the struggles of other oppressed people, other oppressed and marginalized people. And I think it's much more limited on those fronts. I mean, and I think one of the challenges I would raise for a lot of people who articulate queer liberation politics is still, there's by and large either an exclusion of or a marginalization of or a peripheralization of, if I could use that expression, of what you might want to call class politics and politics around questions of poverty. I still don't think those are nearly as central as they need to be to queer liberation politics. So I mean, that would be an area of critique. Those first three areas are, I think, something that's really vital to what the use of queer should be about and the use of queer liberation politics should be about. But obviously those first three things in and of themselves also set us in large part against what I describe as the construction of the neoliberal queer. I realize that some people will actually think that queer politics is per se opposed to neoliberalism, but because of the qualifications around class and poverty, I actually think that there's a way in which some aspects of queer liberation politics don't go far enough in terms of challenging neoliberalism. So that's some comments on how I would sort of situate myself around the notion of queer and also around queer liberation politics. So in some ways, it's a return to the early radical roots of lesbian and gay liberation politics in the early 70s, but in a transformed context in which we're able, I think, to move further ahead than we were in the early 1970s.
All right, great. How is queer liberation expressed in your activism and scholarly work?
I mean, I think it's infused an awful lot of it. I mean, part of it is, I think we now have a tendency to sort of teleport or to project queer liberation politics back into the past. And I think there's some relevance of doing that because early gay and lesbian liberation politics, which were not articulated yet in terms of fixed minority groups, but were actually still about challenging fundamental forms of sexual and gender regulation of our lives. There's a lot of similarity between those early liberationist politics and queer liberation politics, but I do think queer liberation politics emerge in a slightly different social historical context at a later point in terms of the emergence of the AIDS crisis, the development of the widespread resistance to queer bashing and violence against queer people, and the resistance to sort of the normalization, if you want to call it that, of some lesbian and gay people in our society. So I think it emerges in a somewhat different context. But I do think there's lots of roots for queer liberation politics in the type of activism I was involved in the 1970s, certainly lots of roots of it in the right to privacy committees organizing, which interestingly enough, even though the sort of rubric of the resistance movement was actually the right to privacy, which is a real sort of liberal, almost neoliberal notion in some ways, it was transformed in the organizing of the right to privacy committee. So there's also this transformative aspect to queer liberation politics, whereby we turned this liberal notion of right to privacy, which could be really used in a very conservative way, like, whatever we do in private should just be ignored, instead to say that what we were doing in the bathhouses was actually in our community space. It was in that sense constructed as being private from our vantage point, and that even people in parks and in washrooms engage in practices for the construction of privacy and intimacy in state-defined public places. And therefore, that could also be defended using the rubric of the right to privacy. So it was really transformed from being a narrow liberal notion into being one of the ways we could actually secure our right to the world. And that sort of transformation of something that could be very narrow and very neoliberal in character being expanded and transformed was something that I think was a really important contribution of the Right to Privacy Committee. And around AIDS Action Now was actually realizing that direct action politics had to be central to queer liberation politics, but also recognizing that we had to actually engage with questions of healthcare, drug companies, the unequal distribution of resources around the world, right? Recognizing that to deal with AIDS in Africa really involves a massive redistribution of wealth and resources on a planetary scale. And beginning to realize that the terrain for queer politics could actually be expanded incredibly. I mean, one of the interesting things about AIDS activism was, at least at certain points, it did broach questions around poverty and class, because that obviously became an important reality for people living with AIDS and HIV. And unfortunately, I think after the mid-1990s, that concern largely has been eclipsed. Not that the needs and concerns of working class and poor queer people have disappeared, but they've fallen off the radar screen of the mainstream movement because its focus has been on formal equality and things like same-sex marriage rights, which don't directly attend with those needs and concerns. So certainly that's how I would see queer liberation politics having been bound up with the activism I've been involved in, and certainly, part of my work has always been about queering various aspects of the social world, whether it's the social organization of sexuality and regulation of gender in the context of Canadian society, whether it's about national security, which has been the major focus of my research for a while. So queering national security from the vantage point of queers, which also puts in question national security itself as an ideological practice that is always based on excluding some people from the fabric of the nation and only including some other people. But understanding that national security and the Canadian War on Queers, to that extent, was not only about the oppression and marginalization and discrimination against queer people, it was also productively, on the other side, in a relational way, the construction of heterosexual hegemony in the Canadian context, because heterosexuality was constructed as the normal, natural, safe, secure, and national sexuality in that context. So it helped to construct the relations of the closet, helped to construct the relations of oppression that we face.
Okay, we move on now to the questions that you have chosen. Under history, you've chosen 3. And the first being, what can queer liberationists learn by looking at our past?
I think history is really crucial. And one of my ways into both activism and into theorizing about activism has always been historical in character. I've been very impressed by some of the grassroots oral history projects that existed in the States and in Canada and elsewhere. One of the things I've always been interested in, and I think is really crucial for us, is to understand that we are part of history, right? We live in history right now. I think there's this tendency in our social world, because of the way history has been constructed, to think about history as being about the distant past. It really has nothing to tell us about what we're doing in our historical present, but we do live in a historical present that was produced through struggles and confrontations and negotiations coming out of the past. And for me, it's crucial for us, if we're going to understand how to get out of the situations we currently find ourselves in, to understand historically and socially how they've been put in place. And also to understand historically, and this is, I think, one of the major things that constantly draws me back to historical work, is how even in incredibly restrictive circumstances, incredibly repressive circumstances, queer people and other oppressed people were always able to fight back and to resist. So part of what we do in the Canadian War on Queers book is to document that everyday resistance that actually fucked up and messed up the RCMP campaigns against queer people, that actually forced the RCMP to alter its strategies. So even like in 63, 64 in Ottawa, prior to any real organizing among queer people, people were able to resist, to not cooperate with the RCMP. So there's incredible resources that we can learn by looking at the historical past that we can use as resources for struggle in our historical present. But it's also a question of beginning to understand how shifts took place within our organizing efforts. Right? So that when I joined the gay liberation movement in the early and mid-1970s, we were not organizing for same-sex marriage, right? We had slogans like, abolish the family, right? Smash monogamy, smash heterosexual imperialism. I mean, those were some of the notions that we had. How does that get transformed into a situation where the mainstream of gay organizing now sort of believes that with the winning of same-sex marriage rights, basically most things, not necessarily everything, but most things have been achieved. How does a movement get transformed from being a radical, grassroots, contestative, transgressive movement into becoming a much more accommodationist movement in our historical present. And I think we find the resources for a lot of that in the historical past, and also some of the resources for contesting that, for like understanding. I'll just give you one illustration of this, right? When we were organizing against the moral conservative right wing in the late 70s, early 80s, I mean, you know, when Anita Bryant was being brought into Canada, when Jerry Falwell of the so-called moral majority, actually the immoral minority, was being brought into the country, when there was actual organizing on an incredible sort of moral conservative basis going on. And that, it's not that organizing has stopped. I think we haven't been focusing on it as much. But at that point in time, there was an awful lot of queer and lesbian organizing. There was gay liberation against the right everywhere. There was lesbians against the right. There were really quite important organizations here. And we understood that we weren't the only people under attack by the moral conservatives, and that we had to learn from the other people who were under attack. We understood that is absolutely crucial to how we would organize and mobilize. And even at the time of the Right to Privacy Committee and the resistance to the bath raids, it was understood that we had potential allies in all of the other people, all the other communities of people that were under attack from the cops. And we constructed forms of alliance with them. You know, Lamona Johnson speaking at the second major demonstration against the bath raids, the widow of Albert Johnson, who was murdered by the police. That we had a contingent of 400 or 500 gay men in International Women's Day in 1981, because of more gay men than ever before were actually able to see the links between the feminist movement and what we were doing. That whole notion that our movement was bound up with these other social movements, and if you look historically at where the gay movement comes from, it comes out of a circulation of struggles and context created by these other movements. So recapturing that history and being able to use it as sort of tools and maybe weapons in the present against sort of the neoliberal accommodationist currents in our movement is, I think, really crucial. So for me, history is vital. And it seems to me, it's really unfortunate that one of the problems in gay organizing, I think in lesbian organizing too, but in gay community formation more generally, is that we've not been very successful at communicating what happened in the historical past to new generations of people as they get politicized and come out. We've been not very successful at that at all. So that unfortunately for a lot of young queer people emerging onto sort of the political stage right now, like they exist in a world in which, you know, there's these sort of gay ghettos, these gay publications, gay marriage, same-sex marriage, all of these sorts of things are sort of the political framework in which they operate in. And many of them find those interesting and appealing, many of them don't, and many of them therefore are not particularly interested in organizing on those fronts. I mean, there's lots of queer people who are now organizing around anti-poverty issues, around no one is illegal type issues, around the rights of refugees, immigrants, and migrant workers, who wouldn't touch the mainstream gay movement with a 1,000-foot pole because they just don't see it as reflecting their experiences of marginalization and oppression in the society. But they're still very active and out as queer people, right? But they're not, in that sense, active parts of a queer movement. So part of it, I think, is to pull together the different resources and capacities that could reignite a sort of queer liberation movement in the current context.
Did the gay liberation movement borrow from other movements, and if so, which movements and how? You were just touching on that briefly there.
I mean, I think that I don't think the gay liberation movement could have emerged without other movements. I mean, the two most significant ones would be the Black civil rights and Black power movements and the feminist movement. I think without those movements, you really wouldn't have seen the emergence of the gay liberation movement. There had to be a number of gay people who already had experiences in organizing for social change and were able to use some of the ideas and perspectives coming out of the Black liberation movement and the feminist movement to even create the preconditions for instance, for the Stonewall Riot. The Stonewall Riot was really the coming together of, you know, street and bar people with some of those people who had experience in organizing in other social movements, and finally realizing that they could actually use those skills and capacities in terms of their own particular form of oppression, in terms of queer oppression. So without those other movements, I don't think that the gay liberation movement, or in a broader sense, the queer liberation movement, would have been possible. And it's really, I think, very unfortunate that those connections, those lessons have largely been lost. in terms of how we understand queer politics, right? So even the story of Stonewall gets written as if it's not dependent upon anything else. It just sort of happens. It just sort of stands there on its own. And we don't see that Stonewall itself as that particular, rebellious action and the igniting of the gay liberation movement would have basically been impossible without like the Black Power movements, without sort of like a model of a civil rights movement, a movement of oppressed people. It would have basically been impossible. Without the context created by the anti-war movement, without the context created by the New Left and the student movements, the initial emergence of gay liberation just would not have been possible. And of course, there's people right now in our communities and movements who have an active invested interest in us forgetting those roots. I mean, this is where a term that Patricia Gentile and I in the Canadian War on Queers talk about the social organization of forgetting, right? As a really important way in which ruling takes place in our society. It doesn't just take place from sort of Canadian government officials trying to get us to forget the nasty things that the RCMP or CSIS did in the past. It also takes place within our communities, where new sort of middle class queer strata, lesbian and gay strata, actually want us to actively forget those historical associations and those connections, right? But in my view, queer liberation would not have been possible without the Black liberation movement, without the feminist movement. The context would just not have been, would not have been possible. And in that sense, to understand that social movements never exist like in sort of hermetically sealed chambers, right? I mean, what you actually see when people start to move is, to use an expression that comes out of autonomous Marxism, there's a circulation of struggles. People actually take, forms of struggle, forms of organizing from one movement, and they use it in another. And it might not work quite as effectively, but it actually gives some inspiration and some mobilizing capacity to those movements. And in some ways then what you see in the 60s and 70s is like a circulation of struggles moving from the Black liberation movement to the feminist movement to queer liberation emerging, right? And reinforcing too, because like queer liberation then has an impact back on those other forms of organizing. The Black Panther Party's constitutional convention in, I'm trying to think of when it was, early 1970s, I would say 1972, where they actually were like one of the first political formations to actually, through Huey Newton's statement, to actually come out in support of queer liberation, at least on some levels, right? It was inconsistent and not enough, but there was a response to queer liberation from those other movements. And within feminism, obviously, there was the emergence of lesbian feminism. So to always understand those circulations of struggle is really vital and important, and I think that's one thing that we've forgotten. And we obviously are in a different context right now, in the context of much more neoliberal times, not the sort of social movement times of the 60s and early 70s. It's harder to see some of those connections, but they're still there, right? And there's still an important circulation of struggle. So for me, yesterday I was at the Occupy Toronto event. I mean, that to me, it's not explicitly queer in any particular way, right? But the ways in which people are organizing and struggling could be a real inspiration for the reigniting of a queer liberation movement, especially one that wanted to actually deal with questions of income disparity, poverty, and class.
When you were talking about the forgetting, are you talking, in a way, it's like what we call now erasure? Is that something?
Yeah, I mean, but I'm actually suggesting it's something that's socially organized. It's not just that we individually forget. I mean, if you think about the mainstream media, if you think about official history, if you even think about the historical, sort of more mainstream historical accounts produced about gay and lesbian history, a whole bunch of stuff gets erased, right? Some of the early, even who was involved in the Stonewall riot, right? That we're really talking about trans people and butch dykes and really unrespectable people who wouldn't be the ones that would be glamorized right now, were actually the driving force of getting out there on the streets and responding to the police, right? A lot of that's been lost, right? With this sort of romanticization and glamorization of Stonewall and Pride Day and all of these sorts of things, and then the commercialization and commodification that's taken place around it. So for us, in writing the Canadian War on Queers, the antidote to the social organization of forgetting is what we describe as the resistance of remembering, like actively resisting through our memories of people's experiences, that we have to be able to recover in a sort of lived way, that we have to be able to feel those struggles and resistances of the past, and that those are really useful for us in the historical present.
Off script here just for a second. It does get me thinking about some of the frustrations I know I felt and others in our work, say, with Sea All Grow and even currently Career Ontario, in attracting people to the movement and getting further help from others. And also what few people have said in these interviews, even in a recent one where they use the term amnesia,
Mm-hmm.
and in my mind I'm thinking it's almost like a convenient form of amnesia, because I can't help but think it's psychological for a lot of people. People just, not to generalize too much, but there's a lot of people out there who seem to be invested in a celebratory kind of framework, and they struggle with struggle. They struggle with negatives and conflict, and that we're not there yet, and all those things they just clasp on to something that we can celebrate, like same-sex marriage, and or that we can keep our jobs and we're getting richer, kind of thing. I mean, and so it's, some degree of reason to say like it's kind of like a convenient amnesia that people want to believe that things have really improved and things are better and it's not as bad as the awful past, and we're beyond that.
Right. I mean, in terms of some observations around that perspective of sort of trying to understand where this historical amnesia comes from, and I think that's a really useful way to talk about the social organization of forgetting. But I think it's more than just an individual psychological amnesia. There's a social character to it. And there's mythologies that then get constructed within gay communities about how certain things happened, right? And we conveniently forget certain types of things, like even where Lesbian and Gay Pride Day comes from, right? In terms of the resistance to the bath raids and how it was an explicitly political event. That history's really been lost. But if you actually look at the class and social location of a lot of these people who want to sort of simply celebrate this very narrow, largely white middle class notion of being lesbian or gay or queer, there's something about their social location and new class interests that actually leads to this historical amnesia. So it may have psychological dimensions for particular people, but it seems to me it's also about a way of privileging and justifying the social positions those people are in, often at the top of our communities, right? So for them, if your project is actually to integrate yourself into a broader sort of white middle class of people, right? If you want to simply become part of that class, to be able to make money, have the same power and privileges as that group of people, you don't want to actually remember some of these connections, right? They're troubling and they're difficult, right? You want to construct this different type of history that actually sort of sees us because of the charter and things like that. I'm wondering if I could get some water. Is there, a glass or something would be good. I'm just going to start choking here at stuff.
Maybe get a note as well. Yeah, I remember, it wasn't from the book. I read your piece on forgetting. It was
In Canadian Dimension?
Maybe that's where it was. That's where I saw it. And it really triggered for me, this has been so frustrating over the years. And so you're talking about it now, and I just thought, yeah, I wanted to bring that piece in in terms of my own thinking on that. And it's ongoing.
So a big part of it, I guess this is still on, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So a big part of that is also about class, right? For me, a class type of analysis is something that's really of our examination of what's happened. And it's lacking even in those people who otherwise I would really think, they're right on in terms of their critical analysis. But if you actually see that part of what's gone on is that the people who actually benefited the most from the grassroots rebellions of our movements, like say from the resistance to the bath raids, the people who ended up benefiting the most is a sort of professional, managerial, sometimes business strata within our communities. Those are the people who then rise to the top once the mass movement dies down. Because I think when the Right to Privacy Committee was a mass organization, those people were largely kept under control. Their skills and capacities were used in the interest of the movement as a whole, which was largely defined by sort of bar people, street people, and in a general sense, working class queer people. But once that mobilization dies down, once there's no longer a mass organization, those people are now able to sort of speak as the legitimate representatives of our community. And they know the languages to speak in, they have the professional credentials, and they begin to rise to the top. So I think you actually see the formation of this new professional middle class sort of queer strata that emerges and begins to define and articulate its own interests and its own class interests, but they also have consequences in terms of, like, if our class interest as a group of people is to actually fit into that broader white middle class, obviously we have lots of interest in saying we're just like you, right? You know, we're just like you, except that the gender of our partners is different. We're just actually exactly like you, right? Aside from that, it's the only difference we have. And if you simply accept us, right, into your class of people, right, if you accept that we can have same-sex marriage, if you can accept that, you know, we're okay in the corporate boardrooms and all of these sorts of things, then everything will be fine. And in some ways, that's what their agenda becomes, right? And it's very much about being integrated into this broader white middle class. And that, for them, once that happens, that's sort of like the end game, which is interesting because it also means that another group of people who've been abandoned by that particular group of people, and not necessarily consciously all the time, is queer young people, right? Like who have to live in the social form of education and schooling that exists in our society that continually reproduces a really violent form of heterosexual masculinity, right? So those people are abandoned because, in a certain sense, what the white sort of queer middle class people want is simply, you know, to be let in as adults to that class of people, and they've really forgotten about the heterosexist terror that still is mobilized in the lives of lots of young queer people.
This was left running.
Yes,
Oh, good,
yes.
good, because that was very good.
Thanks so much for the water.
Yeah.
That's great. Oh yeah, there's so much there. There's so much there. I'm going to go through this for a second as well. I want to have you maybe touch upon that difficulty we face for those who rise to the top, and I can picture all kinds of people, but I also want to take some responsibility for this ourselves, those of us who did go into academia. And I'm thinking in particular, just as a prime example, is that one of the critiques Queer Ontario gets in the current times, our own living historical times, is, and our members, our active members are very conscious of this, and we feel like we're walking on eggshells every once in a while. Queer Ontario is too academic, the language we're using, and too analytical, and some people just can't relate to us. And so we've got some of our members saying, like, bring it down, you know, and anyway, and some of that comes from someone like me who's chairing it, and also we've attracted people who come right out of universities or are currently in universities, either as students or as scholars, and some people can accuse us of rising to the top, and where are we taking things?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also raises really important questions about the politics of language. Because, I mean, there's ways in which language can be mobilized as a way of excluding people, and there's very different ways in which that can be done. I mean, it's in part done by this professional managerial queer strata, or new middle class strata, by them being able to mobilize their professional credentials, right? To actually be able to speak in particular types of ways, or to speak in particular types of authority. Like, it's really interesting to me how gay lawyers, right, actually are a very significant stratum. And I'm not trying to critique gay lawyers in general, they do lots of wonderful things, but that they actually in some ways been able to establish themselves as people, especially in the context of the Charter, right, which privileges their form of knowledge, as being sort of spokespeople for the movement beyond simply the legal capacities that they might have. So I mean, I think we really need to think about the politics of language, but in a twofold way. There's two sides to this. One is, it's really important for us not to use language that unnecessarily excludes and marginalizes certain people. And I think that's a critique that probably both of us should actually engage with, right? Because I mean, when you're located in the academic world, even partially, even if it's not, you know, where you really always want to be, it does influence some of the language you use, and all of the disciplines that we participate in the academic world are based on constructing specialized languages that systematically exclude people. The other side of that, though, and I think equally important, and sometimes maybe even more important, is if we understand that part of the social organization of forgetting is the systematic denial to people of ways of analyzing their lives and experiences that actually would allow them to come up with a critical social analysis, then you also begin to realize that there's certain terms, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of moving that we are actually denied, right? So sometimes when people are saying, you're using a type of language I don't really understand, I don't relate to, or could you dumb it down a bit? Sometimes they're making a really good critique of you're using like professional or academic language, and please could you stop using that? So it's a question of translation that could be really legitimate and important there. But sometimes people are actually saying, I don't know what you're talking about because I don't know how to think about those things, right? I don't know how to think critically about the social world I live in. If you mention the word capitalism, I have an aversion to that. I don't like you talking about that. What they're really talking about is like you're using a language that actually has a certain type of critical social capacity to it that is challenging to people, right? But I think part of it needs to be how can we make that type of critical language, language also relating to queer politics, more open and accessible to people? How can we create situations in which more people can actually make it their own language? And I think that's a somewhat different way of seeing some of these complexities. So, I have a double-sided response to that, which is yes, we need to be as accessible and as open as possible. We need to also understand that different people are going to express their ideas in different ways. And sometimes we have to translate between those different language forms that people are using. But we also need to understand there's something wrong with the tools we already have. Like what we've been given to analyze our worlds through the educational system, through the mainstream media, is not adequate for actually analyzing those social worlds, right? For critically analyzing them. And that means that there is going to be challenges. There is going to be contestation. People do have to actually learn new languages, right? We have to, one of the problems with the English language in terms of how it's often put forward is you think about definitions and boxes, right? Well, let's put that there. Let's put that there. What you don't see is a way of putting things together, connecting the dots, thinking about things in terms of movement and process. And that's sometimes, I think, what people are getting at when they say, you're using a language I don't understand. And in that sense, we have to try to convince people that some aspects, at least, of that language are really important to learn. And it could be really empowering and important for them as well.
Okay, great. Your last question on history is, what are the most pivotal moments in our histories, and what can we learn from them?
There's two ways of thinking about pivotal moments in history. One would be those organizing moments when we've learned an awful lot. Right? So I could talk about Stonewall and its international ramifications in terms of like an incredible extension of queer circulations of struggle around the globe and in many different ways. There's I think in the Canadian context, things like the resistance to the bath raids, or in Montreal, the resistance to the trucks raid. Very important mass mobilizations of people that won concrete gains and victories in terms of the response to the bath raids, pushing back the police, meaning that most people who were charged got off on their charges. In the trucks rebellion, actually creating the conditions in which, way before anywhere else, people were actually able to get sexual orientation protection in the Quebec human rights legislation. Those are really important experiences. Things like ACT UP in the United States, or things like AIDS Action Now here in Canada, are really important experiences. Some of our organizing efforts around sexual orientation protection. I would think also about one of the things that's really often forgotten is how significant and important in our advances in the late 70s and in the early 80s and later was actually winning support from the union movement, right? And that was not just that like heterosexual people in the union suddenly decided, hey, yeah, we should be supporting human rights for lesbians and gay men. It was actually pushed forward concretely by the self-organization of queer workers within various unions and various workplaces. And I think we often forget that. That actually played an important part in shifting support for lesbian and gay rights and concerns in the Canadian context. So there's those types of pivotal moments, which I think it's really important to focus on. But I think there's other pivotal moments, too, that we actually have to look at, like the Charter, which opened up lots of possibilities, but also closed off other possibilities, right? And I think if we privilege the story of the Charter as being what gave us all our rights, which unfortunately is somehow mythologically now being constructed. It's, the charter was wonderful because it's what allowed us to get all these things. Well, only in the sense that we were able to use that space to struggle for our rights in particular types of ways. But the other side of the charter is it also reorganized our movement in a far more of an individualist way around particular individual cases, in ways that that collectivities of people, movements of people no longer were defining what the agenda was. It actually became defined much more by lawyers and individuals who were launching legal cases. It actually transformed the character of the movement. And we were able to make amazing advances on the level of formal legal equality, but in terms of substantive social equality, that, the charter is not very useful in that, which is why we have this ironic situation right now, where, on a formal legal level, aside from some components of the criminal code and censorship, we could actually make an argument, you could make an argument that we have substantive, formal equality. But if you look at substantive social equality, we're nowhere near reaching that, which is one of the reasons why if you scratch the surface of sort of heterosexual tolerance for queer people, you'll find queer bashers, right? You'll find people who will respond in an incredibly violent way to us. So it's a really contradictory situation. Like, how can you have all of these formal legal rights on the one hand and pervasive social hatred towards queer people on the other? It's because we haven't got at those substantive relationships of oppression and inequality. We really haven't substantially challenged or transformed institutionalized heterosexuality or heterosexual identity. It's still there, even if it's restricted in some significant legal ways in some contexts. Right? Like, we can be members of the military, but there's still tons of informal practices of heterosexist violence that continue to exist there. I mean, the military is not a queer-friendly institution, and the police are not either. But we've made incredible victories on some levels, but on the other hand, if you actually look at the experiences of marginalized and poor and working class queer people and young queer people, there's a lot less progress that's been made. So again, it comes back to this question of who's actually benefited the most, right? I think it's a fairly limited strata of white middle class, largely men, but not only men, who've benefited from our movements. And it's in a similar situation to like who has most benefited from the feminist movement. Unfortunately, it's been a limited stratum of white middle class women, which is not to put down those gains and victories, but for the vast majority of women, the situation in their lives has not substantively improved. I would also want to suggest that, there's been some real significant and important victories and changes and gains in the lives of lots of queer people, but for the majority of us, there's still really profound forms of oppression and marginalization that aren't being addressed and that need to be addressed.
Okay. And in the area of, you had that great analysis of the charter. There's a section here on rights-based claims troubling equality. And you've chosen the question, is there a tension between the pursuit of legal rights and social rights? And I know you just talked about that a bit. I don't know if you want to add a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tension between sort of formal legal rights and substantive social rights is a really significant one. I mean, there's problems with the notion of rights per se, but I'll sort of leave that aside. But I do think that largely how we've interpreted legal victories has been in terms of formal legal equality, especially using Section 15 of the Charter. We've been able to use a legal shift in Canadian state formation that the Charter put in place to actually establish, through our struggles, I mean, it wasn't something that automatically happened. There were lots of struggles that had to take place to establish this formal legal equality, lots of resistance to it. But nonetheless, we were able to use that space that was opened up by Section 15 of the Charter to establish formal legal equality in a whole series of areas. But it hasn't had the same impact on substantive social equality. And in a certain sense, one of the problems with formal legal equality is it has this sort of formal character to it. It doesn't necessarily carry through in terms of the actualities and realities of people's everyday lives, which is one of the reasons why I think we sort of live this contradiction between, oh yeah, we live in Canada and it's supposed to be wonderful because we have all these formal legal rights. And on the other hand, we continue to live the rest of our lives in this reality of oppression and marginalization, right? Which is lived differently by different groups of people, and obviously lived the most horrifically by poor queer people, by trans people, by young queer people in particular, by queer people of color as well. There's major difficulties and problems, and part of that is also that the strategy of formal legal equality does not understand that our oppressions, as we live them, as actual people, right? Not not as distinct categories or definitions, but as actual people where like race, class, sexuality, and gender, and ability, health relations, all of these things are bound up together, is that we can't compartmentalize our lives, right? So if you have formal legal equality in one area, but you're actually living in poverty, it doesn't really help you in lots of ways, right? And the lack of integration of the different aspects of our lives is one of the problems with formal legal equality. Substantive social equality would actually entail dismantling institutionalized heterosexuality in fundamental ways. And I think that the legal transformations we've brought about so far have only done that in very limited ways, have restricted it in some ways. But if you actually look at popular culture, if you look at the social organization of schooling, if you look at the social organization of knowledge more generally, heterosexism is still quite rampant in our society. And until we actually get at that, we're not going to get at the fundamental roots of our oppression and marginalization.
That was great. So under intersectionality, you were interested in responding to, what do you think of identity politics? Advantages, disadvantages?
Okay, I'm going to actually take this up a bit differently because I want to actually raise a challenge around intersectionality.
Oh,
Because part of it, I mean, I think intersectional analysis is a step forward in terms of our analysis of the different ways in which different forms of oppression connect with each other. But intersectionality, if you think about it, is like you're focusing on the intersection of different relations of oppression, right? So let's just say we're talking about class and sexuality here, right? It's that moment of intersection that we're focusing on. And for me, that's really important, but it's not enough. That's why I actually prefer what I would describe as a mediational type of analysis, which would understand that if we're dealing with, let's just say class and sexuality for simplicity here, that class and sexuality are different forms of oppression, right? They have their own moment of autonomy and specificity. But you also can't think about them or theorize them without understanding that they're always everywhere constructed in and through each other, which is much more profound than intersectionality. So it's a recognition of autonomy. You can't reduce sexuality to class, or the other way around. But you also, that doesn't get you very far, right? You actually, to understand sexuality, you also have to think about it in relationship to how it's constructed in relationship to class. So that, for me, is a more useful, theoretical, and struggle-oriented framework than intersectionality. It comes in particular from the work of anti-racist, please strike that, anti-racist feminist Hemani Banerjee, who talks a lot about a mediational approach. So for me, that's the most significant thing I wanted to say about intersectionality, that I understand why people want to develop that type of analysis, but I'm just not sure it goes far enough. It's not just simply that things intersect every once in a while, but that you can't actually theorize about the relationship between those different forms of oppression without seeing that everywhere and always they're constructed in and through each other. So it moves us beyond intersectionality. So then you could go back to that question.
Which is, what do you think of identity politics, both advantages, disadvantages?
Yeah, in general, I'm opposed to identity politics, but I want to qualify that as well. And I do think it's important to go back to the early years of the lesbian and gay liberation movements, when we didn't talk about ourselves so much as, being these identities of being gay or lesbian, but that there was actually this gay or lesbian or queer capacity that everyone had. So it was a sexual capacity that was being oppressed and marginalized rather than specific fixed identities of people. I think the problems with identity have a lot to do with identity being something that's about who we are as beings and being about our essence, rather than about the social practices and doings that we engage in. So I think there's something about the notion of identity that gets us to fall back into this, you're in this identity, but other people aren't. It gets us into this system of sort of rigid classifications of people, and can also get into really messy discussions about, my identity is more oppressed than yours, and all of those sorts of things that I think can be really detrimental about identity politics. So my preference is to actually focus on people's doings, how we actually do, let's say, masculinity or femininity, or how we do homosexuality or heterosexuality, or how we do queerness as a social practice that involves the particular activities and doings of people. So that's what I would prefer. On the other hand, I do want to make a qualification. I think there's some people who critique identity politics, who see the identity claims of, say, lesbians and gay men or feminists or people of color as being the big problem. And they leave aside the identity politics of those who rule in our society, because they do have an identity politics, right? There's an identity politics of being Canadian, right? That's coded as being white and middle class, largely Anglo. The identity politics of being heterosexual, right? Which oftentimes we don't critique that type of identity politics. So we critique the identity politics of the oppressed and marginalized, and we don't critique the identity politics of those who rule and manage our lives. And it seems to me we need to recognize a difference there. I mean, identity politics in general has its limitations, but we really need to focus our attentions on the identity politics of those who rule and manage our lives. So challenging what it means to be Canadian, disrupting that, trying to bring into view, Indigenous struggles all the time whenever we're trying to think about Canada, without annihilating that history of colonization of Indigenous people. Those are some of the things I think we need to also begin to do. But to recognize that there's real reasons why people who are oppressed and marginalized want to claim or name their own experience, right? I think that's important, right? That we have histories that have to be recovered. We have experiences that have yet to be really spoken about, that have yet to be really named. And that capacity is really important. So that needs to be fully developed. Well, I think we need to develop a certain type of critique of identity politics. Maybe some solutions are along the following lines. Andrea Smith, an Indigenous feminist activist and scholar in the United States, uses this expression, identity plus. We have an identity, but we're never simply just that identity, right? We're always more than that. The Zapatistas have this in Mexico, have this expression, we are Indigenous, but also all these other things, right? So yes, you can accept a certain notion of identity, but you don't accept being narrowly confined within that. You always say it's much more than that. So we could say we are queer, but also all these other things. I mean, for me, just to say I'm a queer man, right, or I'm queer, is absolutely politically necessary in the current circumstances, but also in some ways, it doesn't really tell you very much about me at all, right? It doesn't communicate very much. For us to still be trapped within what Michel Foucault would have talked about as sexuality being the truth of our beings, like within that regime of sexuality, is something we still have to escape from. And that's why I think we need to put more of our focus on doings, practices, capacities, pleasures, desires, rather than these narrow identity classifications.
Thank you. So, Trina.
So you've got someone else coming in at 12?
Yeah.
Is there any possibility of continuing this at some other point? Like not today?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it depends on how useful, or whether you think you've got enough useful stuff out of it already.
You do have a lot. Your analysis are very, very good. So,
Yeah.
There's more stuff I could talk about, but I'll leave it up to you. So why don't we leave it, if we're going to end now, or I don't know, is the other person here?
no. It's just
Yeah, she's just pointing out, we've got about 10 minutes left. So,
okay.
So we'll see. Yeah, just 10 minutes. So let me see. I'm going to do a quick...
Prioritize whatever you think is most useful for your purposes.
I'd like to take on the questions that most haven't taken, so that we haven't covered. Those are kind of similar. That would be good. That would be good. I like that too. So let me go with a last one you've chosen for intersectionality, and then there's a couple of others. What can queer liberationists teach other theoretical perspective frameworks or movements? So what do we have that we can teach others?
I think that's really important, because I think we have to, on the one hand, recognize where we've come from and how other social movements have created the possibilities for our movement even to exist and for our perspectives to even exist. But I think we also have to focus on what is that moment of autonomy or specificity that our movement brings to all of those other movements that isn't there in those other movements on its own. And it seems to me that's a particular focus on sexuality and eroticism, a particular type of critique of institutionalized heterosexuality or heterosexual hegemony, or various different terms have been used, a critique of heterosexism, that's something we need to bring to all of these other social movements, and they need to take that up and respond to it. Something they need to learn from us. And that's quite crucial in this respect. In that sense, sort of the challenge to institutionalized heterosexuality, the two-gender binary system, has to be central to the messages that we actually communicate to other social movements. This is one of the problems, I think, is unfortunately, the way in which lots of other people in social movements take this up has been, oh, it's just about individual homophobia, and once that's resolved, then everything's fine. Or, you know, the irritating comments and questions that my partner Patrick and I have got from like liberal, well-intentioned heterosexual people about when are you going to get married, right? As if we would ever contemplate that, right? We think it's a horribly oppressive institution. Why would we want to do that? But they get informed by the sort of mainstream organizing, that's sort of the political framework we're in. And I think what we need to do is to return to a much more radical, hard-hitting critique of institutionalized heterosexuality and the two-gender binary system as being absolutely crucial, not only to our movement, but to the progress of all of those other movements. I mean, it brings us back to, you know, Charlotte Bunch's speech in the 1970s when she spoke to heterosexual socialist feminists saying, you know, it's not for lesbians only. Lesbian feminism is not simply for lesbians. It actually brings things into view for all women, right? In the same way that our movement brings into view for all people interested in struggling for a different type of world, that you have to engage with sexual politics, that you have to challenge institutionalized heterosexuality, that you have to challenge the two-gender binary system. I think we even can make important things visible for those people who define themselves as being heterosexual, who no longer want to live within institutionalized heterosexuality, right? We actually can open up, can give advice to people, create spaces in which it's possible for people to either want to do heterosexuality differently or perhaps do something else in terms of their eroticism and relationships. So that focus on sexuality, the key components of sexual and gender politics are absolutely central in terms of what we bring into view. But also like bodies, also like sensuality. I mean, I think there's a way in which oftentimes those questions get expelled from the basic framework of various different social movements, and I think we bring them into view in very exciting and useful ways. So that would be the central contribution, I think, that we make to other movements.
That was really good. I'm going to combine what you were trying to articulate with a question under Today and Tomorrow. So the question under Today and Tomorrow is the queer liberationist movement transnational? And I'm just looking for you here. You got our homonormativity and homonationalism as conceptualizations adequate in addressing the conservatism rather we often
Face, probably. Anyway,
face.
who knows what I wrote.
Yeah. So I
yeah.
kind of see them as linked a bit,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Okay.
So if you want
So-
to just talk to that.
I mean, there's probably two basic things I want to say. First of all, I think that when Lisa Dugan uses the expression homonormativity to try to describe how there's now this stratum within lesbian and gay and queer communities that tries to sort of mimic the normality of heterosexuality, she's getting at something very real. I think when Jasper Huar talks about homonationalism, especially in the US context, where you actually now have layers of white gay men in particular who are like horribly patriotic and support imperialist wars and all those sorts of things, they're getting at stuff that is really very real. My concern about those notions of homonormativity and homonationalism is that because they're not grounded in an analysis of the social historical process that's brought them into being, they can tend to become moral epithets, right? Oh, so that's homonationalist, or you're being so homonormative, which could be useful critiques of individual practices, but I think they're trying to get at something that's much broader as a social phenomena, as a social practice, and I think we need to understand more where that comes from. And I think the missing dimension of that is that they actually don't, neither of them specifically engages with class politics. I mean, they're really good on other questions, but they don't specifically talk about class politics and the emergence of this sort of new white middle class managing or maybe even ruling layer within lots of gay communities. And that seems to me something that's missing. That's part of this project that I'm now engaged in terms of trying to talk about the social making of the neoliberal queer. Now, having said that, we also have to put that in the global context we're currently facing. Because I think that there's ways in which some aspects of mainstream gay and lesbian organizing have actually got implicated and taken up by relations of neocolonialism and imperialism on a global scale. Because part of what's happened with capitalist globalization is the enforcement and exportation around the world of this notion that there's heterosexual normality, but there's also sort of this queer, well, usually would be lesbian or gay deviancy, right? So you have only two choices, right, in terms of your sexual identifications. You're either heterosexual or you're lesbian or gay. And if you're lesbian or gay, it means you're sort of at least like coded in a little bit with deviance, right? But that's actually in some ways an imperialist neocolonial project, because if we actually look at all of the different societies and cultures around the world, they don't organize their sexualities and genders that way. So one of the cautions, I think, is that we actually have to avoid being implicated in that process. I mean, there still are societies and cultures in which there's more than two genders. There's still lots of cultures where trans people, intersex people are actually recognized in a very different way than in sort of Western northern societies. And part of what's going on is the eradication of those particular sexual practices and social practices and gender practices. And we actually have to resist that. We have to develop a type of politics that actually, on the one hand, does talk about, people want to be lesbian or gay or queer. We need to create the social space for that everywhere on the planet. But if people want to identify and construct themselves in different ways, we also have to create a space for that. So that's a difficult situation for us to situate ourselves in. And I think that's a really important challenge that we face. Because we do not want to be part of imposing on other people and other cultures this restrictive binary opposition between heterosexuality and homosexuality when it wasn't necessarily part of their culture and their society to begin with, right? We want to open up the possibilities for people to have more control over their sexual lives and over their eroticism, obviously. So I think it needs a broader, critical sexual politics that moves beyond simply being sort of queer focused and related when we actually deal with people on a global scale. And we also have to realize that we need to ally with people who are fighting against neocolonialism and imperialism. And I guess the last thing I'll say is around Palestine, right? And the controversies around queer support for Palestine. I mean, part of what is the problem here is that there's part of this constellation of forces is also then to construct certain cultures around the world as being backward, because they don't actually have the recognition of lesbian and gay cultures in the same way that we might have in the United States or Canada or Western Europe. So there's now this sort of Orientalist, to use the expression of Edward Said, that is constructing people living in the Middle East as having some sort of different, backward or maybe even barbaric character as compared to people in the advanced West. There's a sort of Orientalist construction that Muslims and Arab people in some sort of uniform, unitary way are actually really backward on women's rights and really incredibly homophobic and in opposition to queer people, even though there's incredible diversity of sexual and gender practices in the Arab and Muslim worlds. But there's been this sort of Orientalist notion that somehow those are like the most backward people around us. And you have moral conservatives who would never talk and champion feminism or lesbian and gay rights here in North America, who are concerned about it in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine. So we have to understand how this is actually being deployed and try to disrupt that. Because it seems to me that it's really important for us to point out that there are people in Palestine and other Arab and Muslim cultures who actually are either organizing against queer or organizing in some way that expresses an opposition to institutionalized heterosexuality and the two-gender binary system, that we actually need to figure out ways of supporting, without necessarily dressing it all up in our verbiage, in our rhetoric, in our language. And there has been this global movement of queer solidarity with queers in Palestine that Quaya, Queers Against Israeli Apartheid here in Toronto, is part of, that I think has been vilified and come under attack because it's precisely one piece of the contemporary queer movement that gets in the way of that type of Orientalist project. It's actually suggesting that queer people are in solidarity with Palestinian people when they struggle against the occupation, and they struggle against the apartheid-like practices of the Israeli state, but that we're also there to support queers in Palestine. And we're also there, in a certain sense, to queer the Palestinian struggle. I mean, I think that's something that's often forgotten. And we're there to create more space for people who identify as being queer. in the Palestinian context, or whatever they want to identify with, or however they want to organize around their sexual and gendered needs. And that to me is it's a really promising development in terms of trying to navigate some of the very difficult tensions and contradictions that we face when we try to organize on a global level. Because it's actually challenging one of the central pillars of the so-called war on terror, that somehow Muslims and Arabs are uniformly backward on these questions. And for me, responding to that type of challenge and critique of queer people who've been in solidarity with Palestine is really quite central right now, and opening up more space for that type of solidarity to take place.
Okay, thanks so much.
And I think we're now at the end of our time.
Yes.
That was good.
That's good. It
If
was
you
good.
if you feel like there's anything else, I mean, I'm around here every once in a while, but
Right,
we've probably
yeah.
got time frames too.
Yeah, exactly. But I like where we ended because we were able to make the connection between the last two questions, so that was good. Thank you so much, Gary. You've given us a